Hello, welcome everybody to our Meet the Nominee event with SFMTA board nominee Mike Chen. We are going to get started here in a moment. First, I'd like to briefly introduce uh, my co-hosts for this evening. Josie Dominguez Chan from Walk San Francisco, who's the community engagement manager there, and Claire Amable, Director of Advocacy at San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. Claire, over to you to introduce our guest.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dylan. And again, my name is Claire Mable. My pronouns are she and they, and I get the honor of introducing Mike Chen. So Mike is a data engineer with a history of working in the internet industry and marketing and product analytics. He currently works as a data engineer at Coda, a software company where he organizes information to help people make better decisions using data, tables, and dashboards. Prior to that, he worked at Meta for nearly 8 years, primarily as a data engineer. He has both a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in Mathematics from the University of Pennsylvania. Mike joined the SFMTA Citizens Advisory Council in January 2020 and served as its chair from July 2021 through July 2023. He is a frequent rider of Muni Lines 1, 38, and 49, and uses both his own e-bike and bike share to get around the city. As an advocate for housing, transportation, and urbanist causes, Mike has been an organizer in his neighborhood and a volunteer lead for YIMBY Action, a housing advocacy organization. Mike lives in the Lower Pack Heights neighborhood of San Francisco and regularly enjoys Clay Slow Street. And so at this time, I want to pass it over to Mike to give us a 5-minute introduction of himself.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Claire. I'll try to be quick so we can get to questions. Again, my name is Mike Chen. I grew up in, a little bit about me, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio in the suburbs. And so like a very different understanding of things until I moved to Philadelphia for school. And then when I moved to Boston, where I learned about transit, rode a bike around, and lived kind of like a fun like 20s lifestyle. And then I moved to San Francisco about 10 years ago. I got into advocacy around land use, housing, and transportation, kind of like slowly thinking about, I think, my job is in systems. And so thinking about systems and how things work. And, as a user of systems, especially in transportation, right, you think about all the things that you're like, oh yeah, maybe this could be a little bit better, a little bit better. And when there was a vacancy on the MTA Citizens Advisory Council, I contacted my supervisor and said, hey, there's a vacancy. Would you like to appoint me? And thankfully, she said yes, Supervisor Catherine Stephanie. And I served there for 4 years and 2 years as chair. While I was on the Citizens Advisory Council, we looked at a lot of things that happened, especially like during COVID, right? Considering the bus network, especially the critical network during COVID, and how to bring that network back around the budget, JFK Promenade, Geary Rapid, probably Great Highway, slow streets, shared spaces, Valencia Street, and most of the high profile things that ultimately went to the MTA board, the CAC looked at, and it was sort of like, like a JV board, right? It doesn't have explicit decision making authority, but it's something that the CAC would make recommendations to the full board to say, hey, you should look at this. These are the things we should prioritize. And through that, I kind of gained a much more in-depth understanding of the agency than I did before. My other hat is that I was recently elected to the San Francisco Democratic Party Central Committee, endorsed by the Sierra Club, partly on my transportation platform. Let's see, other things. I'm a renter, walker, bus rider, biker. You can ask me if you're curious about my feelings about moving apartments, about the MTA, about my feelings about arrival predictions and like the customer information system, and signage. I think that's like that. Those are things that I just like have like opinions about. And from that, I'll turn it back to Claire.
Yeah, awesome. Just from that, like it already sounds like you are incredibly well versed in the realm of things that all of the organizations here will work on. So thank you for that. So at this time, each of the organizations is going to get 10 minutes with you. At the 2-minute mark, we're all gonna kind of give you like you got 2 minutes to wrap it up. Before we open it up to questions from the rest of our members. So I can kick us off with the questions from the Bicycle Coalition. The first question is, with the biking and rolling plan entering its final development phase, what do you think a visionary and transformative plan looks like? How can car-free and people-centered corridors like JFK and slow streets fit into the plan to best serve the needs of all San Francisco communities? Yeah. Ooh.
Okay. I think the end goal that I believe the agency that wants to work towards is to say we want to give people good options to get where they can go. It doesn't all it that are reliable and competitive with let's say like with driving. And so to say, hey, like we want to make sure that if people are making the trips to say, oh, they're going to their gym, they're going to work, they're going to a hospital or healthcare, they're going to meet their friends at a bar or a restaurant. When people are making their transportation choices, it should be competitive, right? To say, hey, like that they can walk there, they can take bike share there, they can ride the bus there. And so that's sort of like, I think our end goal is to say, we want to make sure that when people have real options, and then they can take choices that are good for the environment, good for climate, good, that help make the city safer for everybody. So that's eventually where we want to go there. The biking and rolling plan, as I understand, is sort of like the update to the city's transportation plan, which is to say, hey, okay, how do we implement this over the next 8 years? I think what I would like to see is that, for example, for driving, we have created sort of like this network of streets, right? So if you're going somewhere, there are generally certain streets that you will tend to gravitate towards. And so one example is I live very close to Bush and Pine streets, right? If you are a driver, you know that these streets are timed for a certain speed. You know, these streets are kind of like optimized for throughput. And so those are the streets that you will generally take if you live within that area and you want to go east-west. I would like to see something very similar for thinking about biking and rolling, to say, hey, if I am going, let's say, from my home to work downtown, I currently take Post and Sutter because those are probably the lowest volume streets. And actually, the MTA is thinking about doing a Sutter quick build project right in the next couple months. And so I would like, for these options, I'd like to be people to be able to say, oh, I can within, I don't know, 3 or 4 blocks, I can find a route that gets me close to my final destination. And so what JFK Promenade and these other, the eventual network I like to see is to say that there are streets that people know that they can go and it feels comfortable to bike there. And that we can also encourage people who currently are afraid to bike around, understandably, because the streets can be pretty nasty, and to say, oh, I actually can't do this. And try to accelerate that network as much as possible within the constraints of funding, infrastructure, and the political situation.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And then my next question is somewhat related to the first. Our city has ambitious climate goals of 80% sustainable modes of transportation by 2030. How will you support and encourage equity priority communities like the Bayview, for example, to mode shift?
So I have a couple thoughts. First thought is that equity neighborhoods, I think in general, are actually more transit using neighborhoods. So they actually are a bit ahead of other places places in the city in terms of sustainable mode share. And so how to and so I think that's not that I do not see the outer neighborhoods, right, such as the Bayview or equity communities, is necessarily like the people who are lagging. They're actually in some ways leading the charge around mode share. That said, I think that there are many challenges around the connectivity and around equity around priority equity communities. And so one thing that in my research around this, I've heard a lot about, for example, a lot of police enforcement around lowriders, for example, in the Mission. And so there's been a history where the city has really aggressively gone after and marginalized and punished, I think, sometimes the transportation choices of people getting around. And so the past couple years, especially when thinking about bringing back the network from the depths of COVID, the agency has tried to make considerable choices to really make sustainable choices a good option for people. And one example is when they were bringing back lines, bringing back the 8X to serve, I think, kind of like Viz Valley and some of the other neighborhoods around there, bringing back, starting the new 15 or the new old 15 line, which provided like a very fast way from Bayview to downtown and parts in between. And as we consider our mode share goals, I think we want to take particular care to listen and make sure that we're addressing people's needs, and make sure that people are not left behind, and make sure that we make investments kind of like equitably throughout the city.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And I think we might be up for my section, and I will pass it over to Dylan for the next.
Thank
Thank you, Mike.
you. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, so for San Francisco Transit Riders' first question, since 1973, the SFMTA has been governed by the city's transit first policy, which states that government agencies must prioritize the movement of people and goods with a focus on transit, walking, and biking instead of private automobiles. So my question to you is, what does transit first mean to you? And how will you guide the agency to adhere to this policy in practice?
Ooh. So while I was on the CAC, there was a person on the CAC who represented merchants, who frequently brought up, right, this line of the transit first policy about the safe and efficient movement of people and goods. So I've heard that a lot. I think for me, and then there's a bunch of subheads, right, about exactly what that means for bicycling and what that means for buses and transit. What I think that means for me is to say, we have a lot of people in San Francisco, and we have a lot of commuters from outside coming in, lots of people who are trying to get to things that they want to go to, and that the whole range, because transportation is a connective tissue of the city. And how do we get people where they want to go? And I think the first, like, the trade-offs are we want to make sure people get there safely. We want to make sure that people get there efficiently, and partially, I think, also like reliably. So those, when making decisions, I think from the point of view of transportation or from the point of view of other agencies, I think we should be thinking about, for example, if everybody in San Francisco drove to all their destinations, that would be, we would see this like Carmageddon throughout the streets, right? There's just not enough space on the streets. There's not enough parking spaces for everyone to actually do that. So in some ways, for the city to work, we like, even now, we need to be able to figure out what's the most efficient use of limited road space, which is something that Jeff Tumlin talks about a lot. We have, it's not like we can widen our roads, for example. And so we can say, hey, for this much pavement, is it better? How do we study the best use of the space? And one example that I found that the agency has done a lot, for example, on Geary, is to say, hey, like, Geary transports a ton of people, in terms of the transit line. Before COVID, it was one of the highest ridership lines west of the Mississippi. And so thinking about how do we make sure that when people take Geary, right, that we are prioritizing riders on making sure that all the riders on Geary, which maybe rival or exceed the number of people driving on Geary, are getting there quickly. And what I've seen the agency do with the transit lanes, with the queue jumps, the bus bulbs, right? Each of those things is some way to make sure that transportation and that people can see that the more efficient way for the system is also a better choice for an individual. And so that's something that I would like to make sure that happens, and thinking about how we kind of nudge the incentives of the system so that when individuals make choices, it's not necessarily that they always make the most efficient choice, but they are making overall kind of like choices that are system positive.
And I guess, what do you see the role of the board being, besides this? I think I heard you mention a lot of like communications. Is there more to the board's role in, when it comes to the transit first policy?
For the board's role, I think is, the role of a board, right, is not necessarily to micromanage, right? I think every single part of the staff agency, but what I would like to see, the board's immediate influence, right, is usually hiring and firing the director, right, who currently is Jeff Tumlin. And what I think the board can also pass policies. And also when they vote on specific projects that come up to them, they can create or amend things such that to be better or worse than a transit first policy. And so where the board, I think, how the board intersects with the transit first policy, I think, is how do these principles, which are written in the city charter but are not strictly binding for the city, and how do we translate that into policies that are more binding or more sort of nudging the agency. I think the board has value also in talking to other agencies and other departments in the city. And one thing, for example, is that it feels like sometimes other city agencies, other city agencies have a lot of veto power necessarily on MTA stuff, but I would also like to make that a two-way conversation, so that the MTA can also bring its expertise and say, hey, this is how staff and the board and people who are advocates and experts in transportation think about how other agencies should be following that out. So I would hope that it's both translating kind of like these high level policies into practice, and also being messengers of that policy and practice to other departments.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. And yeah, kind of changing gears a little bit, although I see it as kind of related to transit first. Recently, San Francisco transit riders advocated against a 20% uni fare increase for Clipper users. We argued that increasing transit fares disproportionately hurts low-income people, who make up the majority of Uni's riders and often rely on public transit the most. But at the same time, SFMTA is facing a pretty big fiscal cliff, which threatens cuts to transit service if left unaddressed, and could potentially, lead to cost increases elsewhere. Do you believe fare increases should play a role in addressing the fiscal cliff? And if so, can you address some of those equity concerns? And if not, what other funding sources would you look at?
Ooh. So I'll first acknowledge and validate that yes, the uni is looking at a very scary funding deficit, mostly because of a loss. It's a loss of ridership due to COVID. It's also because Muni gets a lot of money from other sources, and those sources are driving up. One-time sources from the state and federal government because of COVID have been conserved conserved and kept forward, but they will run out in about 2 years. And so I really, as my role currently as an advocate or as a potential like MTA board member, I'm very interested in the regional transportation funding measure that may come in 2026, and I hope that can help a lot with Muni's funding issues. That said, sort of in between now and then, Muni directly, I think, has a limited number of tools at its disposal in terms of revenue. And typically that is fares and fees. And that's something that, for example, in the last budget cycle, that those talking about the fare increases or talking about increases to those or changing those was a big part of the interaction between the board and the staff. And then maybe a third thing. So within my power, I would like to explore kind of like funding sources that are outside of the Muni's remit, which almost certainly will require like a ballot measure. And so within the power that I would have as an advocate or as a board member, trying to figure out what it's a combination of what's like financially feasible. I think what's politically feasible. I think what's like kind of like what the funding source could be, and does it advance the policies of the agency. And I think when we're talking about kind of like equity and regressive policies, I think I might have a slightly different view from the transit riders. And I think that money funding sources that the agency has are regressive, right? So we have a lot of flat fees, we have a lot of flat fares that are sort of independent of your income. The agency also has discount programs that try to mitigate, I think, those effects on sort of like the poorest folks. I'd like to think about how if a policy change on net is regressive or not, because I think if a regressive revenue source is used for progressive ends, I think that those things I think on net that actually might be better. And what I'd like to think of, and for example, right, let's say for example, like for a rider who's like a senior on fixed income, if I say, hey, would a hypothetical rider be willing to pay 25 cents more per ride if that meant one extra bus on the 8 Bayshore? Would someone be willing to pay, right? Would that be worth it for them if there was another safety planner working in the Tenderloin or in Chinatown? And so I think when we talk about revenue sources, we should think about the totality of the effects. I believe that there are spaces where the impacts to equity are neutral or even net positive to within kind of like and while advancing the MTA's goals. Maybe I'll stop. And I think that's true both in what MTA controls and also sort of like the wider realm of possible other things that may have to go to the ballot or through legislation.
Great. And I do want to also we have a little bit extra time here. So if you do want to dig in a little bit more on addressing some of those equity concerns around fare increases, I'd like to give you some time to speak to that.
Yeah, I'll throw in a couple things. So while I was on the CAC, I served on the Citizens Advisory Council with Chris Arvin, and when we looked at fare policy on the CAC side, Chris Arvin brought up things, for example, like currently my understanding is that the limit at which you start receiving a lot of the Clipper discounts is 200% of the poverty level, which is something about $57,000 for a family of 4. And in San Francisco, that's something like 40% of AMI. If I someone please correct me, but I think it's actually it's a very, very low number. And it's sort of like, well, in other situations, for example, for housing, you're usually eligible for the most common sorts of affordable housing, right, at a much higher level. So something about 60% or 80% of AMI, which is the area median income, which means for a given household size, let's say a family of four, the level of the income that half of San Franciscan households of that size make less than, and also half of San Franciscans make more than. So I think so. So one thing is to say, hey, we should be looking at within the power of the agency, we should be looking at, hey, like maybe more people should receive discounts and subsidies. Maybe we should make sure that that as many people as possible who are eligible for the subsidies are able to find them, and that maybe looking at things like access and like how, for example, like what hours and what locations are the discount offices open at, and how easy is it to get that. So I think mitigating kind of like the worst effects for the lowest income, while also recognizing that many people do have the ability to pay, and currently my belief is that fares are about $15 million, and so that's the equivalent of roughly 15 buses, if I remember right, running like year round. And so like thinking about the opportunity cost and saying, hey, like, what could we get with this money? Is this net equitable? Is this net good for the agency's goals?
Great, thank you. With that, I will pass it along to Josie for some questions from Walk San Francisco.
Hi, everyone. I'm Josie. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Walk San Francisco. It's nice to meet you, Mike. And my question for you is, what do you think the city should do to help more people feel safe, comfortable, and joyful while walking in San Francisco?
I have a couple different. I guess there's like maybe like two ideas. One is that I think what the end goal of where I think we should go, and I think what maybe we can do in maybe the short term. I think the end goal is that we want spaces that people. We generally have some research about like what makes people feel like they enjoy walking around, and so it's things like level of street trees, how fast people go when they're driving. It's about the infrastructure improvements, about crosswalks that people feel safe going around. It's about leading pedestrian indicators, which is when the walk sign turns green sooner than cars, earlier than when the cars can go. And so I think we have a body of research that says that people, what makes things both in actuality safer and also by perception makes people feel safer. And so what I would love to see is to say, hey, like we have great sidewalks, we have great crossing infrastructure. I think what we've seen in terms of the program whose name I totally forget, which is the street activations that have historically happened, like sometimes on Valencia or on Hay Street, to make walking both feel safe, to make it in some ways joyous and very, very useful. I think combining that with thinking about like making sure that, for example, that more people are able to walk to kind of like their essentials, like the grocery store or the bus stop. And so I think both making it feel nicer and also giving people more of a reason to say, oh, well, maybe I don't need to drive to this store, right? Maybe I can walk to something closer. That's sort of like the long range idea. And then if you'd like, I can just follow up with the short term, but I'll stop here.
I think that was great. My next question for you is, what does Vision Zero mean to you? And how do your life and professional experience inform how you approach this issue in equity priority communities throughout the city?
So I used to live near Franklin and Gough streets, which, as many people will know, they're a couplet of streets that are that are designed for high driver throughput. I was not too far away from. I lived not too far away from Gough and Geary, where there was this really tragic fatality of someone crossing the street and someone driving at very high speed collided into them, and that was something that I had at one point was crossing almost every day, and so in sort of that intervening time, I've also seen the agency make work on trying to make things safer. And so, like on my block, which was on Franklin Street, I saw the agency put in these. Was it the paint and the safe hit and the posts, the rubber posts, the plastic posts that encourage people in cars to drive wider circles, so they have to turn slower, and it's much more visibility of people in crosswalks. I saw the agency put in turn restrictions so that people would not be trying to cross the street while folks are crossing the sidewalk, crossing the crosswalk. And in my perspective, I think this did make my intersection feel a lot safer, and it was not like I had to swivel my head so much going around. So I think that's like personally what I've thought about for Vision Zero is thinking about how do we what are the systems, right? What are the systems that we can use to make things in actuality safer, and also give people the confidence that yes, when they cross the street, right, they're like nobody like that they can do it safely. How do we work on that in priority equity neighborhoods? From what I've seen, the agency, for example, work with people in the Tenderloin is one place where there's a very high concentration of people, and a high concentration of people who don't own cars, who do take transit and walking to get around the city. And I think working with that community to talk about their needs and their fears, and then I think pairing that with the MTAs, I think like staff knowledge and expertise and training in saying, okay, well, here are things that we believe work based on what we've seen in other cities and based on our training, and hopefully kind of like merging those two things together and getting and resulting in areas where it's like where people actually are safer, and where kids can cross the street to go to school and to their playgrounds better, and seniors feel a lot safer. And so what I'd like to see, and I think the agency is doing this some already, is again, like we don't, again, like trying to make sure that the agency is understanding needs, understanding pain points, pairing that with information and data to know, and then working to create solutions that help create that safety in actuality and in feeling, that I believe are two sides of Vision Zero.
Okay, thank you. And I'll hand it back to Dylan.
Thank you, Josie. We are going to go into audience questions now. Before I do just want to go over again those guidelines that I shared earlier. First of all, just a reminder to please keep your questions constructive and appropriate for all ages. If you haven't yet, you can, or if you already have and want to submit some additional questions, you can do so by sending in the meeting chat a message to questions. So click on the drop down and choose questions as the recipient there. Only meeting hosts will be able to see what you put in the chat, and we'll work behind the scenes to elevate as many questions as possible. And also include your name, what organizations outside of the 3 that are here today you're a part of, as well as whether you're a member of those any of those 3 organizations. And again, we'll be working to prioritize questions that address the issues within the scope of the SFMTA board members, including questions about policy oversight, values and priorities and process. Try to avoid or elaborate on any sort of specialized jargon or really niche questions. We'll be trying to prioritize the questions that are most interesting to as wide an audience as possible. So with that, I believe Claire has the first audience question.
Thanks, Dylan. Okay, my question is from Christopher P., who is a member of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition and the San Francisco Transit Riders. Small businesses often oppose changes to current road designs and on-street parking. How should the SFMTA respond to that?
I have a couple thoughts, and I'm going to say that I don't want to speak on any project that I may actually have to go that may come before me if I am appointed. So I'll try to keep these in generalities. You know, when I think when people have objections or questions, I think sometimes you have to ask like have you heard of this thing, the 5 whys? I've heard this thing at work where someone's like, you want to do this? And you're like, okay, well, okay, you don't like this. Why is this true? And then you sort of like ask the whys and try to figure out what exactly is the core of the issue. And I think both that idea of 5 whys should be applied both for like merchants, right? To think about, okay, well, what exactly are like what exactly are the pain points here? Is it loading and unloading? Is it about employee access? Is it about making sure that there's foot traffic or customers that get to their business? And I think that should be applied for merchant side. I think it also should be applied a little bit to the agencies and to the agency side. And my experience is that sometimes staff, I think, immediately go to oh, we are doing this for reason X, and reason X is not always explained of how that necessarily gets around from let's say the city's transit first policies, or like what's the thing. So I would hope that I think both that once people understand sort of like the values that are at stake, to say, hey, like because our agency is tasked with the safe movement of people and goods, that creates these implications, and that's why we're getting to this specific project eventually. And then also when we say, okay, well, the reason is because of customer access, or because of loading and unloading, or because XYZ, then I think you can then kind of say, okay, well, these are two kind of different values. Are there things that the agency can do to help mitigate things? Are there things that the agency just has not noticed around the specific implementation, to try to work with people? And I think, but sometimes, right, I think that sometimes, maybe oftentimes, some things are irreconcilable. And at that point, I think the agency should be trying to do what it can within, I think, within financial constraints, within staff constraints, within, I think, admittedly, political constraints of what can be done. Do what it can and kind of and gives good reasons. And Director Amanda Eakin, I think sometimes does this along very well in board meetings. And at that point, I think people can disagree, but at least they can understand the whys. So that's sort of like, I think my rough idea. I'm happy to follow if there's a follow-up. I'm happy to explain more, but that's sort of like that's where I'm coming from.
Great. The next question comes from Sprague T, who's a member of all three of the co-hosting organizations here today. As some background, some transit agencies across the country organize their fares so that if you're tapping your card over the course of a fixed period, like say a month, you only get charged for at maximum the cost of a monthly pass. So this ensures that frequent users of the system aren't charged more than the monthly pass rate if they're using the system that frequently. And that can be helpful for folks who aren't able to pay upfront or aren't able to figure out how to pay upfront, things like that. Sprague's question is, do you support fare capping for Clipper card users, and will you help push this forward? And are there any other fare programs you would support to make transit affordable?
I love this question. And I've seen this. So the policy is sometimes called fare capping or fare accumulator programs. And so it's sort of like a pay-as-you-go program. So you can swipe a bunch of single rides, and if you eventually meet the cost of a monthly pass, you just get the monthly pass for free, right, the rest of the month or the rest of the week or what have you. And I've seen this when traveling. I've seen this a few places. I think New York City has it, I think, famously, and they advertise it on their subways. I've also seen it in places like Hawaii, which is like mostly a bus only system, and it's like a very like friendly system for tourists. So I asked, I've talked a bit to like the fares team at MTA, I think through the CAC, and it's something that's on their radar. Without going into too much jargon, basically, we're currently on Clipper 1.0 technology, which is like a 16-year-old technology that worked very well for its time, but it's sort of old and it's very complicated. And what the agency and or the MTC, I don't know who what their strategy has been is to say, hey, Clipper 2.0 is supposed to be rolling out soon. We're going to wait until Clipper 2.0 comes out, and then we can start implementing it on a much more modernized and a much more like easier system. Clipper 2.0 has been delayed, which is very sad because, as my understanding is that it's not tapping as quickly as expectations when applied to different systems. So there's just some performance issues right now. So it was supposed to be rolled out actually this summer. It's not rolled out, and so I think it's a great user experience. I think we're supposed to get an update about where Clipper 2.0 is in a few months, and I would love to see it happen. That said, the agency CFO, Brie Horder, has sort of has said, hey, like, like we should also be considering that fare capping could have a financial cost on the agency, and so to think about like, make sure that the agency sort of like acknowledges that this is a good trade-off. But I think it's something that the agency should do for its riders, and I would hope that in the long run, this is revenue neutral or even revenue positive, because it helps get more people onto the system.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I have our next question, and it's coming from an anonymous member of the San Francisco Transit Riders and Walk San Francisco. Are there Vision Zero related safety upgrades you feel should not be compromised on individual projects?
I'm like trying to go through like all the different vision zero treatments and being like, okay, well, are there things that are like are always? I don't know if this is like an easy one or a hard one, but like one thing, for example, is that when you go out into the west and south side on the Muni Metro lines, sometimes the trains let you out onto the pavement with no concrete and no protection. And I find that a little baffling. That I think I understand why, but I find it a little baffling that we would let people like load and unload onto the street without any sort of safety zone where people could be driving around. Like, and maybe there's a reason, but I think when we have high volumes of people walking, and when there's high volumes of people walking and vulnerable users, I think right next to high volumes of people going at speed in high vehicles, like those are places where the potential conflicts are very high. And I would like to see more changes. That said, I think we live in a world of compromises. We live in a world of compromises and constraints. The one thing, for example, is that because the transportation bond failed 2 years ago, that has resulted in less money for the agency to kind of like go around and do some capital projects that would be more concrete, traffic signal improvements, certain things that are safety. And so what people can do in the meantime, for example, with the K Ingleside project, is to say, okay, well, maybe we can't get the concrete right now. We can get that maybe in 4 years. In the meantime, let's think about using plastic posts to really demarcate the loading spaces, which hopefully will allow unlocking of the second car of the K train at West Portal so that there's just much less delay. So trying to, in summary, I really want to be aggressive and prevent loss of life, loss of injury. I'm also sensitive to the constraints of the agency, and I want to get to a point of like let's try to implement quickly. Done is better than perfect. Let's try things and then iterate as we can.
Thanks for that answer. I have the next one that is from Tim H., who is a member of all three of our organizations. What do you think about freeway removal? And would you support intelligent projects that return space from freeways to other uses? An example of such a project is Vision Boulevard to replace the Central Freeway.
So I'm aware of, I think, 2 different ideas of free removal, and as I think probably most people maybe here may be aware, is that there's been a history of finding the freeway, taking down freeways. Probably the most, are these the 2 only example? There's a freeway revolt back in like the 50s, 60s, right, about the Panhandle. When the Loma Prieta earthquake happened, the Embarcadero Freeway coming down unlocked a lot of space along the Embarcadero, kind of like made the ferry building much easier to get to. And then the Central Freeway extension past Market Street on Octavia, that coming down sort of helped unlock the value of Hayes Valley. And so that's sort of like, I think, some of the history. I'm aware of the Vision Zero project thinking about the Central Freeway extension from, I don't know, it's like 101, and then where 101 kind of comes off and then goes along like DuBose Avenue, right? And then gets to Market Street. And I've also heard rumblings about, when Caltrain gets to the Transbay terminal, right? I think there's some idea of like alignment, which also is considering the section of 280 north of Mariposa Street, I think. I think those are 2 things that people are talking about. I have not taken a position on either one. I think from the point of the agency, from the point of like the MTA, is thinking about, okay, well, does this meet the agency's goals? Does this meet the agency's goals about, like, for example, sustainable mode share, the safe and efficient movement of people and goods? I think it's also about, but we've seen, for example, that that freeway changes, right, are not necessarily bad. We've seen, for example, with Hayes Valley, the changes to Hayes Valley, the changes to the Embarcadero, right? I think there can be a lot of positives. It kind of unlocks land for housing, it unlocks land for transit. It changes like the look and feel of a neighborhood. I think there's also like externalities. And so one thing was when the Embarcadero Freeway came down, one thing was to start planning for the central subway, and that was part of sort of, as my understanding, that was sort of part of the agreement with to help maintain access to Chinatown. And so thinking about how I personally, as an advocate, I've not studied it. As an advocate or as a layperson, I've not studied the entire issue. I'd love to kind of like see like, hey, like, how does this work? How does it work in terms of agency goals? How does this work in terms of what are the impacts to the city as a whole? I think most people would agree that taking the freeway down north of Market has been a net good. And so I think it can be done well. The devil is in the specifics, but that's something that I think the MTA, I think would have to work in conjunction with Caltrans to do. And so interesting idea. I sort of reserving judgment. We've seen where it works. We've seen places where it can work well. And so let's continue thinking about it.
You. So this next question comes from Dia, who is a member of all three orgs and also on the SF Transit Riders Board. She asks, City College has touched almost all voting San Franciscans through its employment or students. Do you support fair free transit passes for CCSF and other academic institutions?
Ooh, interesting. So thank you, Thea Selby, for your service on the Transit Riders Board and also for your past service on the City College Board. My understanding is that currently there are academic institutions that have agreements with the MTA to provide muni passes to all their students. And that's usually, I think, it comes through a student fee. These agreements are very sort of like bespoke, and like I think basically the MTA goes into agreement, sort of estimates, okay, how much usage will these students use based on the number of students and their travel patterns, and then basically says, okay, we're going to give this bill to the institution, right? And maybe we also add like maybe like a bulk discount, right? And so that way we kind of create these things. I've been very intrigued actually by these sort of institutional plans. Caltrain, the agency, I think has also done this a lot for a lot of employers. And I am interested in using ways to sort of like make uni usage sort of come for free as a fringe benefit to things. We already do this with Chase Center Arena events, for example. Like if you buy stuff at Chase Arena, your event ticket also doubles as a muni ticket, as an incentive to get people to get to 16th Street in Mission Bay Dogpatch, sort of like without having to drive by taking transit. And I hear this year, for example, for Outside Lands, that your Outside Lands ticket also comes with a muni ticket. And so I'm very interested in thinking about how we can expand and scale this institutional program sort of like easily, and maybe not necessarily without in a way that scales quickly and does not consume a lot of staff time. For City College, I think it's like for City College, I think it's sort of like being sensitive to the agency's sort of like budget situation currently, while also recognizing, for example, that the agency has gone into programs like Free Muni for Youth, which is a sort of like which is a free program for people 18 and under, and the idea is that it helps turn people into lifelong transit riders. And so there's a lot of ways that this could happen. I would have to think about, I think, the different values of the agency. One thing that could happen, for example, is to create some discounts to maybe there's some city subsidy. But I also think that I think the agency also needs to be like fiscally what's the word, responsible? I'm not sure. To be sensitive to the budget situation. And so like if there's a way to do it that is hopefully revenue neutral or revenue positive, or even like net revenue positive over time, I think it's doable. So that's kind of like the rough idea.
Thank you.
And the next question comes from Barry T, a special guest. The question is, what is your perspective on autonomous vehicles and their role on our streets?
Hello, Barry Toronto. I think I've heard your voice at MTA board meetings and maybe at the CAC meetings. Hello. Sorry, autonomous vehicles and
their role on our streets.
I feel like maybe a couple thoughts. One is that I'm not sure we can stuff the genie back in the bottle. I think if it wasn't happening in San Francisco, it would be happening in other places. I think there is some value in making sure that if they do work in San Francisco, they work well and responsibly. I think two is that I would like to see much more ability to verify what autonomous vehicle companies tell the city and the state. I feel like the agencies have been lobbying to get more information about possible incidents, possible safety things. And my understanding is that the companies are under no obligation to do that, and they don't do it. And what happened with Cruise, where for people here, one of their vehicles ran over somebody around 6th and Market, and then the company, I think, tried to cover it up, is something that's like, I think, not very good for the system.
5th and Market.
5th and Market, thank you. 5th and Market is, and that's sort of inexplicable. And so as someone who bikes and walks, I've also seen, I think autonomous vehicles, right, there's going to be some space for them. I think it could be, I think there are possible safety improvements, and possible mode shift improvements. I've also seen vehicles do things that I think are a little inexplicable, where I'm like, I'm not sure why you're trying to turn left across 3 lanes of traffic on Gough Street during rush hour. And so like, I would love to be able to, I think for the agency to understand what the vehicles are doing, to be able to guide, to be able to get data and be able to, I think, guide the development of regulation as that comes up at the state level.
Thank you for those thoughts.
Thank you, Barry, for such a timely question. I have the next question, and it is from someone who is anonymous, but a member of all 3 of our organizations. What would your approach be to support agency staff and encourage them to make changes needed to create safer streets?
I think agency staff, especially public-facing agency staff, and actually a large number of agency staff are public facing. When you think about the operators, when you think about line workers, when you think about the planners, I think presenting, transportation is something that affects everybody. I think when people have issues, right, it's sort of like, I think everybody has an opinion about transportation. And I think also, oftentimes planners at the agency or communications folks at the agency are also trying to present change, and change, even if it is to a better place, change can be very hard. And so I would like to look at, I think going back to, a lot of questions ago, I feel like the current process, there may be ways to tone down, I think, sometimes the rancor that happens at these meetings. I would like to think about how to looking at the public outreach process and be able to solve the two goals that sometimes are opposing, which is to say, hey, we want to tell the public about what's happening. We want to get some input. We want to we want people to be informed about things that are happening in the neighborhood, and also the agency is under a lot of pressure to deliver on goals to make streets safer, to make the buses and trains run on time and quickly, so I think maybe there are system things that we can do to help protect staff, I think, from the worst things. I think there are certain ways that maybe that the processes currently are not are creating inadvertently, I think, these conflict points. I think some conflict is inevitable, but I think maybe that can be managed in a way that's there are easier ways and better ways. And so I would like to I think hopefully we can look at process, make things better, and where possible, I have a day job. I have a day job. And so transportation will not be my full-time thing, but I hope to also be in spaces to help, I think, also talk about where things are, and where possible, I think the board, where I think board and the directors should be able to articulate, I think, the whys, and also make sure that staff are able to sort of make decisions and do what they do best.
Thank you. This next question comes from Young H, who is a member of San Francisco Transit Riders. The question is, what are your thoughts around transit signage, and what opportunities are there for better signage?
Okay, I'm glad somebody picked up my thing from the beginning. I think when I moved here 10 years ago, I was taking the 49, I think, from the Mission to home in Russian Hill. And I was waiting, I went to the 14th and Mission stop, and I was like, where is the bus stop? And I think I asked someone, I was like, is this the bus stop? And they're like, yeah, it is. And I was like, how do you know it's a bus stop? Like, I don't see anything around here. And they pointed to it was like a utility pole, and it was about this big, spray painted yellow, and you could see the numbers 14 and 49 written on them. And that was kind of a shock to me. And I think still to this day, that's sort of like the extent of the signage at that stop. And so from the point of view, I think, of someone who's like a tourist or someone who's like not used to transit getting around the city, I think that I think the system on the whole works and does a great job. I think for folks who are just starting out, or who are sort of transit curious, I think the system has some gaps. And I think about the entire experience. So like one thing is like kind of like signage, making sure that everyone knows where the bus stops are. I think there's a couple of things too about like, when you're on the bus, they announce the next stop like 10 seconds or 5 seconds before you actually get to the stop. I don't know if you've experienced this, but it's like you have a very limited window of basically being able to pull the cord and saying, I want the stop. So, I don't have the solutions, but as a writer of the system, as someone who's used the system, who's used like Google Maps on the system, I have sort of collected a bunch of pain points. And hopefully, I've done this a little bit on the CAC, but hopefully as a director, I can be like, hey, like what's going on? Like, why is this thing happening this way? I think we should be much more aggressive in advertising to say, hey, like on the 49 line, like when you're driving, you should be able to look over at the bus stop and say, oh, this bus is coming in 3 minutes. This is really frequent, right? Like when you're walking by Van Ness Market, like you should be able to see, okay, the next outbound K is in 4 minutes. And that tells you whether you can, mosey your way down slowly, or if you need to like rush down the stairs to make the next train. There's a lot of like user experience pain points that, and I have a background in tech, but it's sort of like these are things, each thing is not that big, but I think the accumulated weight of these things does make a system hostile and harder to use. And so, if in the role of the agency to say we should make this like easier, competitive, more reliable, we should be looking at signage, we should be looking at predictions, we should be looking at the directions that Google gives when you like ride a bicycle. Sometimes those things give you like very, very counterintuitive routes. But I would hope, to be able to say, let's really make sure that we get basics right.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, so I have the next question, and it is from Neville Hemming, a member of all of our organizations. And the question is, cars and trucks are getting larger and larger, both in terms of size and weight. Larger vehicles pose greater risk for all other street users, both because their greater mass does more damage, and because they also often have worse visibility. How should the city and agency think about addressing the proliferation of larger vehicles?
This is a great question, and I don't think there's a very satisfactory answer. And so I will co-sign and say that that when people in public health have looked at fatalities, I think the agency and the city has done a lot of work on Vision Zero things, but I think the number of people dying and getting injured on the streets has not really reflected that. And partially, my suspicion, and I don't know, right, is to say there are these other nationwide trends that are happening where the cars are getting bigger, where the strike zones, where the positions that vehicles are now striking people are now more fatal or more deadly. And there are design issues. That said, I think the power that a city agency has to regulate sizes of vehicles is severely limited. And a lot of vehicle regulations happen on at the federal level. California does have some ability. California is special, and they have some ability of also regulating vehicles for reasons that I don't fully understand. And one bill that I'm following this year is State Senator Scott Wiener working on kind of like this on cars in the US implementing technology that's already active in Europe that gives warnings when vehicles are exceeding the speed limit, are going way over the speed limit. And so I'm happy to take that back to staff and kind of ask, are there things that staff can do or the agency can do? The other things that I would like to hope so is that the agency has legislative lobbyists who kind of like go between the board of supervisors and also the state and federal governments, is to think about how the agency should prioritize its lobbying efforts. It took a long time and a lot of work from advocates to get the speed camera pilot that San Francisco is now working to implement. And I would like to see maybe if working within the powers of the agency, right? What are the things that we can do about that? The answer may be not a lot, but I am very sympathetic, and I want to think about like how we can make that easier, or make the situation better.
Thank you.
Okay, your next question is from Cyrus H., who is a member of All Organizations. The biking and rolling plan, formerly the Active Communities Plan, is restarting community outreach after a break. What do you see as the most important properties of a connected grid of safe streets for biking and other rolling activities? And how can the agency try to maximize the chance of success around this ambitious plan? Thank you, Cyrus. Let me know if you need the questions again.
The most important aspect of the plan, and sorry, say what was the second part?
It was, what do you see as the most important properties of a connected grid of safe streets for biking and other rolling activities? And how can the agency try to maximize the chance of success around this ambitious plan?
A couple of years ago, I think there was an advocate around biking who sort of took the MTA's like bicycle map, and then added like difficulty levels to the bike routes. And I totally forget the advocate's name. If you're here, I'm sorry. But I thought it was very interesting to kind of say, oh, you can kind of go through and see, oh yeah, JFK Promenade is like a green circle, like the easy route. And there are harder routes. And then you have like you have like the blue square for, I don't know, like Polk Street, and then you have like Black Diamond for like Portola Drive or something, right? I think, and looking at things like safety, comfort of people, and so what I think I'm thinking about, I think both safety and also thinking about it has to be safe in actuality. I think it has to feel comfortable if we want people to, if we want to encourage more than I think the current riders, right? The current riders, I think, do it because they current people who bike and roll, right? They sort of do it because they think it's out of convenience. It's about the relative comfort with the streets. But to really unlock, I think, the mode shift, we have to say, okay, well, we want something that maybe that a parent will feel comfortable that their teenager could ride on. We want something that people feel more, that expands the circle of people who feel comfortable biking. And then I think there's that, and I think the last thing is probably like it has to be useful. It has to take you to places where you actually want to go. So trying to do all those things is hard. But I would say that in terms of like, for example, like how you implement things, you want to, in terms of the speed or like the direction or the sequencing of how you implement things, I think you want to get to a place where people that it actually takes you to, that it actually is a useful network, and you lower the barrier to entry, so people are like, oh yeah, you know, I actually could see myself taking this. Sorry, that was part one. Part two was about implementation.
Part two is about how the agency can maximize the chance of success around the ambitious plan.
Partially, I think going back to the earlier answer, it's about thinking about how is there the way that we can make the outreach better? Is there a way that we can get the process to work better? Can we reach the right balance of community participation and also going to speed? I also think that the agency cannot do it alone, right? And like I am very I'm very appreciative of work from advocates, right, who are able to talk about the needs, who are able to go out there and talk about the narrative, and I think many of these decisions are both policy decisions, but also political decisions. And so there has to be, to maximize the chances of this working, I think that it also means that it is also changing the political calculus of safer streets, and making it and changing the incentives for staff and government and elected officials, right, to kind of to say that the right policy outcomes are also the most desirable political outcomes, if that makes sense.
Thanks. And this is the last question. We're getting short on time and we want to leave a little bit of room to wrap up. So this can be kind of a speed round of a really kind of a three-part question. So this comes from somebody who asked to remain anonymous, who's a member of all three of our orgs. What is the current SFMTA board doing well? Where could they improve? And what unique perspective would you bring to the board?
What the board is doing well, I think the board is, one thing that I think is interesting is that the board is in general well aligned on issues. I think each board member has different focuses, but I think the directors are fairly aligned on, I think, the policy goals and the vision. And I think the directors are very conscious of, are good stewards and conscious of, I think, the trade-offs that are sort of inherent in an agency with constrained resources. So I think that's I think doing well is a shared vision, and I think a shared appreciation of trade-offs. What the board could do better. Okay, I'm going to pause that. Where I feel like I could do, what could I bring to the table? I have a decent amount of like domain expertise from being on the CAC, from being a direct user of the transportation system from many different angles. I would be probably a younger voice on the board. I'm a renter. I don't actually don't know if that's an underrepresented, but like, you know, I'm in my 30s, early 30s, mid 30s, something like that. I'm in my 30s. I am someone who uses the system a lot. I'm a renter. And I think from my professional background as someone who thinks about systems and data and information, I would hope that I can kind of go in and say, you know, when we talk, like, you know, what does on-time performance mean in a world where we now try to space out buses every 8 minutes apart? If we say that if we feel that Vision Zero improvements are working, how do we actually measure that and talk about that story to the public? I I think that I would hope that, you know, and I think that my, you know, I think from my experience, kind of like talking about like user design and user improvement, I also just like, you know, I want like people want the system to work. And like thinking about how we can how we can list and prioritize the pain points of the agency and really and and make the transportation agency, I think, one of um, you know, I think there's a phrase sometimes in product design about like surprise and delight, to say, hey, like this was actually a lot easier to use than I thought it would be, or this, or you know, I would love for someone to say, oh, you know, I don't know why I waited so long to bike in San Francisco, and so those are things that I would love to kind of talk about. I know that directors are not supposed to like micromanage, but I do, but I want to make sure that that we that the agency is thinking about like the user's experience, the experience of people, of everyday folks, right, who are using the buses, who are riding their bikes, who are walking across San Francisco, who are driving, and make those experiences overall good.
Right. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, everyone. So we're gonna wrap up here. We want to thank Mike for joining us for this Meet the Nominee event. For those in the audience who are interested in next steps, first, Mike needs to be scheduled and approved by the Board of Supervisors Rules Committee, then approved by a majority of the full Board of Supervisors. Mike has shared that the best way to show support for his appointment is to write your supervisor to let them know you'd like to see him approved. We want to thank everyone from Walk San Francisco, the San Francisco Transit Riders, and the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition for teaming up to co-host this event. And if you aren't yet a member of these 3 organizations, please consider supporting our work so we can keep hosting events like this and advocating for better transportation in our city. Finally, thank you to all of you who have joined here tonight, or if you're going to watch this recording of this event. We can't do any of this work without you, so thank you so much for your support.